Yeah, so I'm, actually our refuge is split in half. So the Boreal half of our refuge is part of this LCC, although we're in the southern part. And so I haven't been in this sort of cold weather for a while. And this morning, you know, I wanted to be fancy since I was standing up here, so I put on some mascara. And then walking over, like, I got little crystals on my, you know, on my eyelashes, and then it was like I looked like Candy Say Baker, like. But it's nice to be back in Fairbanks. I did spend 5 winters here while I was doing my PhD, and I really do enjoy it. And so. This whole day is kind of, we're trying, so yesterday we spent time on the why, and now we're going to spend time on the how. And we structured this, at least and so we structured sort of the major themes, on some of Terry's ecosystem stewardship pieces. And so some of the things they talk about when you're in a directional system and you don't know what the future's going to be like, and identifying vulnerability can be helpful for management, and also sort of trying to figure out the possible trajectories of change can be a useful exercise. So that's the first part of the day. We're going to talk about those things. Next, we're going to move on to sort of what sort of strategies can we come up with to deal with changing conditions. And some of these things are general, like flexibility and being ready for surprise, and then other things are more on-the-ground management things. And then we're going to talk about uncertainty, because that's part of not knowing the future, right? People will never know, and it's probably unknowable. And then the final discussion will be trying to pull it all together and think about, you know, having a discussion about. So if we're trying to focus on resilience and adaptive capacity, and I'll even say transformation. What does that mean, and what does that mean for LCC? And so that's the day today, and it's sort of like, you know, just think of these things as these should just be ideas for you guys. Is how we were thinking of this day. We just bring a lot of ideas and creative thoughts, and you guys can think about what things will work for you and what things won't. And so. Just what I'm going to talk today is about climate change, vulnerability, and impact. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on impacts in this region. I'm guessing a lot of you have already seen those sorts of talks from SNAP and Harry. Does that sound reasonable? And I'm going to talk about the process of vulnerability assessment, sort of the types of research you guys could find with an LCC. And so my intention is to, you know, define it, and then talk about the different types of assessments people do to give you an idea of the range of assessments that are out there and how they might work for you, because different ones do different things. And they can inform action. And Eric and I were sort of talking together. It's not like you have to choose one, because often when you're synthesizing a bunch of information, you know, all these like maybe several vulnerability assessments might work off each other, along with impacts and empirical evidence. And future projections that then have some empirical evidence underneath them to have more certainty in those. And so it's a very synergistic process, and it's usually pretty fluid and iterative. And so I wanted to kind of get an idea of how many people have looked at vulnerability assessments or even been part of a vulnerability assessment. Give an idea. So, so feel free to also interrupt me if you know, we want to change this, you know, whatever we want to talk about, if it's something different. But just to get everybody on the same page, vulnerability came out of the IPCC, I believe, in 2007. Their report, they talked about vulnerabilities, and they defined these 3 parts of it. And so these 3 key pieces sort of inform most vulnerability assessments. The first is exposure, and this is the types of change you're exposed to. So climate, temperature change, precipitation change, but also like changes in variability, extreme events, hazard events. These are all considered exposure, so exposure to change. The second piece is sensitivity. And so when we think about that, we think of, you know, how tied is something to current conditions? You know, is it a species where an earlier spring will really mess them up? And then the third piece, and sensitivity and adaptive capacity are kind of related. Sometimes one is it's hard to decide which category to put it in, but adaptive capacity is trying to think about, can things respond? And this is both, humans, do they have the capital to do different things? And in terms of species, do they have the capacity to evolve to these new conditions or to move? And so depending on, what your target is, and I just sort of threw up these as a thought experiment, you might have different variables you look at, depending on whether you're looking at a species or a social system. And in the social system, you get on things like economic diversity, some of these other things that aren't necessarily in ecological assessments usually, but if you're thinking about a social ecological system, may come into play. And there's sort of different approaches, and I'm building on some work that Molly and Erica, well, I guess Erica did a paper where she says, okay, if you think about vulnerability assessments, there's this big group of assessments that are looking at geographic shifts. And so this is like what Fiona showed yesterday. Our bird species is going to move, and if so, where, and are there places that they may remain? And then the second broad type she talked about was these relative indices of vulnerability. And so there's some assessment tools out there where they have sort of a structured way to think about exposure and sensitivity. And when you do this, you can sort of compare species. And these indices, they don't have to be aspatial, like it doesn't always have to be a ranking, but you can also map these sorts of things. But the idea is when you're using these indices, you can compare different pieces. And I added to this conceptual models of social ecological systems. And so when I think of this, I think of a lot of Terry's work. So he looks at the feedback between different parts of a social ecological system, and he has empirical evidence to sort of identify those things that stabilize the system and those things that sort of set it off on a new trajectory. And those things can be very informative to think about where we might have ability to keep things the same or move something towards a more favorable place, shape that trajectory. And when you're doing these things, you have to fit the problem, because depending on the scale, different variables are going to come into play. And so, at really large scales, when you're looking at species distribution models, broad climate can be really informative. But as you shrink down someplace like the Kenai, down parts of Alaska, other things like topography, barriers, soil types, these things start, becoming more important to what's driving distribution, and you get more detailed information. And so this is from Erica's paper, and she talks about how, when you're thinking about this, you have to think about your problem and also sort of what sort of decision time frame you're on. And so some things are going to, at the really large global scale, you're probably on a little larger planning horizon for your actions. Then as you go down to some of these vulnerability indices where maybe you're trying to identify for trout or something, what things are they most sensitive to, and can we do management actions to hold them? And so an example on the Kenai is, we have non-glacial streams that are warming. Salmon don't like warm waters. And so we have some land trusts looking at cold water seas. Then can we protect those parcels where cold water is coming out and keep these cold water areas? And that comes from sort of that structured thinking about what's making salmon vulnerable and what things we have control over, trying to, make it more favorable to them because we like them down there, and I'm sure up here. And so I'm just sort of reiterating this. So it is dependent, and so that spatial scale comes in. In some cases, like a local scale project might have a vulnerability assessment. And it might be informed by larger scales, but it's really about this one watershed. Or you could go across the whole globe. There's vulnerability assessments that are global. And probably, the best ones are when those things are talking. So again, that sort of synergy and information. Temporal scale, which I mentioned. Again, target, what you're thinking about, really, it really drives what you look at. And also, I'm a landscape ecologist. I'm a very spatial thinker, and so I always think about whether it's aspatial or spatial. And I think of like aspatial, sometimes it's really helpful to rank different species. So if you're in Fish and Wildlife Service, and you know which is most vulnerable, and we've been doing this in conservation for years with the red listed species, like what things need our attention. And also that identifying of drivers can be really helpful. When you map things out, and again, these don't have to be mutually exclusive, sometimes you can leverage that geography of vulnerability. And so this is where a lot of my work has been. Can we identify places that are changing slower? And might we try different management actions there? And even at the simplest level, if we have a geography of vulnerability, when we go in to do our next studies, maybe we should stratify across that space. So we're making sure we're looking at the range out there. And I think this leads to an ability to try a diversity of approach. And you almost think of it as a diversified stock portfolio, or people call it that hedging. In my experience, these assessments can be really helpful. And one thing we talk a lot about on the Kenai is this idea of changing expectations. And sometimes it's our expectations, like we'll get a surprising result, and then a whole new hypothesis about what's happening will come onto the table, and it'll get folded into the research agenda. But also, we talk a lot about we need to bring the public with us, and so we need to be having that conversation to change their expectations as well. In terms of we have a pretty strong trend of it's coming up in a lot of different places that our alpine is pretty vulnerable, and people hunt caribou up there. And so having those conversations probably before something happens, trying to set those expectations now might be a useful thing. I've also found that sometimes new problems come on the table, and once they show up, they're everywhere. And an example, this is on the Kenai. Even 5 years ago, we didn't think we had invasive species. And this wasn't necessarily a vulnerability assessment, but we had an intern come in and look, and there was 100. It just wasn't in our search image. And so sometimes these sorts of analyses, they bring things in that just weren't in the search image before. And so that type of learning can be really useful. And so it can identify these emerging problems and sort of redefine the management space. But it also can help prioritize among different conflicting, things that are looking, trying to get our attention as managers. And then the third thing is just giving us some insight into how, when, and what to do. And that we don't have to make it one choice sometimes. At least in the short term, it might be good to try a few different things and keep those options open so we can learn what things work and what things don't. And so this last piece of this talk, I'm going to talk about how vulnerability assessment can be linked to action. And then Amanda had asked me to use an example from a case study that we had worked on for climate change training in Anchorage. And so I'll give you that just to sort of, see an example of what I'm going to show you next with this conceptual model. And then after that, I have just sort of a menu of different assessment types we can look at, or we can have a discussion about the types of things the LCC would need, or whether we think vulnerability can be useful things to pursue. Just give you that sort of outline. So, in some of the way it works, I'm always trying to think about adaptation. And so one thing that we found useful is to think about what our management target is temporally. And so are we trying to hold past conditions and historic conditions where what we're thinking about in our management actions? And in some cases it is. We have many species where population expectations are based on the past. And maybe in short-term space that's still okay. And then the other thing is, are we looking towards the future? Are we trying to manage towards a new state? So when I think about adaptation actions, I sort of use that break. Are they things that move us towards the future, or are they things that try to hold us where we are? And then the other axis that I think is really useful to think about is how much management intervention are we going to put in? In some ways, how much risk, right? Because if you do a lot and it's really expensive and it doesn't work, that's kind of risky. Or in some cases, some of the adaptation approaches that are out there, like GMOs, people talk about GMOs, are more risky, translocating species outside the range. And so there's also this management approach axis. And when you think about these things, so down in this quadrant is probably where we've been in the past, sort of protecting habitat, protecting special habitats that are there today. Oh wait, I'm going the wrong way, no wonder. When you're thinking about the future, but still sort of a low intervention, and you see this in the literature all the time, like connecting habitats or connecting spaces, protecting places that, might be climate refuge in the future. And, it's still pretty low risk because worth it happens you buy some land, right? Now, up in this sort of moving towards the future, high-risk translocation is the example up there. And down here, maybe trying to keep current conditions, but by manipulating the genes of a species, I think that makes everybody sort of tense up a little bit in terms of intervention and risk. And it might not be on the table today, but in the future, who knows? And so when I think about these different adaptation approaches, I think of this temporal baseline to be really related to exposure. Like places that are changing really rapidly, you might not be able to hold sort of past benchmarks for as long. And I think of the intervention piece in terms of sensitivity and adaptive capacity. Like really sensitive species, we might need to intervene a little more if we don't want them to go extinct globally. Or if we have a really special thing on our landscape that's really sensitive and doesn't really have a lot of adaptive capacity, but we really, really want it, we might need to intervene a little more to keep it, if we even can. And so this is an example from the map too, and the Great Land Trust was trying to think about whether their land buying strategies should change when they're thinking about climate change. And so they work around acreage, and they're trying to identify which parcels to buy. And so we use sort of this exposure and sensitivity adaptive capacity, which I sometimes call resilience, although that term is already used too much, or maybe shouldn't be. But we said, okay, so can we look at parcels or watersheds and think about them in terms of these gradients? And will we maybe have different buying strategies depending where you sat? And so we identified some different metrics to look at these things. And from the resilience side, we said, well, places that have a lot of roads, maybe they have more invasive species, maybe they're not going to be able to keep the habitats that are there, maybe they've been more likely to transform to something that is nice. And how much protected land, and that's sort of the inverse. Like if there's a lot of places that aren't going to have heavy development, maybe they're a little more resilient. And the other, actually, the climate change exposure, we looked at the SNAP biome data and July temperature as a proxy for salmon streams. So we looked at July temperature and a sort of an index of whether it was a glacial or non-glacial stream. And this was rough. It was sort of a proof of concept thing just to get the Great Land Trust thinking. And so we had these metrics to sort of bin watersheds out to these 4 different categories. And so exposure looked like this. Red places were more exposed, blue places little less likely to change as fast relative to other watersheds in this region. And this is how resilience works. So, the green areas have more protected land and less roads. And there's many things you can think about, many different variables depending on your needs you can put into these analyses. But conceptually, what we ended up with was these areas where we could parse out, high exposure areas that also were a little more sensitive. And we could put these different watersheds in these different groups and then come up with little different land buying strategies for these places. And so where you have high exposure, you might want to think about protecting your non-glacial streams, your areas where cold water's coming up. Maybe you want to buy those lands so you can plant trees and keep it shaded. Think about ways you could keep those streams cold. But you might want to de-emphasize buying lands that are just special habitats today because you might not be able to, in 30, 40 years, those things might be moving. And we sort of made this thing like, maybe for a land buying trust, when you're in places that are heavily eroded already, maybe your strategy should focus on green infrastructure for people, Maybe those are the important parcels in that sense, places that connect bike paths so people can move around, or that don't draw animals in to the city. So you don't want to be drawing bears into they go anywhere, but drawing your moose and bears into downtown acreage where they're going to be hit. Thinking about those sorts of things. And Great Land Trust said, maybe we don't even operate in that space because that's not what we do. Maybe there's another nonprofit that would go there. Over here, maybe you start thinking about, yes, it's exposed, but it's also a totally intact landscape. Maybe our strategy does focus on keeping it that way. Maybe we work with landowners there and come up with, agreements where we can pay them to not develop. Those sorts of things. Maybe we can buy those parcels in roadless areas that are cheap now because they're unroaded. And actually, Great Land Trust said, we're not really there either. We want to work where people are. We're not going to be going into, parts of the Matt Borough that aren't developed at all and buying cheap land because we don't even see that as a problem, in the next 50 years. And we want to focus on problems that are today. Down in this low exposure side, maybe here it makes sense to focus on important special habitats for people. But again, breaking it into, what's the function, in a really fragmented parts of the city, maybe it's corridors for people, and then the other parts, maybe it's maintaining the equality for other species.
So can I just stop you for a minute? I think this is really fascinating if you think about it to use an actual decision as a providing land. So I'm wondering, I'm not that familiar with Great Land Trust as a mission. Is their mission is it conservation kind of generally, or is it more human?
It's conservation generally, but they want to work in places that are being developed.
Okay.
So again, so those places, because I'm a big landscape person, so I was like, you have Denali National Park and the Alaska Peninsula, and it's totally undeveloped, but it's not, it's not in the federal state, or so in the long term, as that city grows, potentially those, I was like, you as Great Land Trust work to connect those places, and they were like, yeah, no, that's not what we do.
Great Land Trust is one of 5 regional land trusts in the state of Alaska. Largest of the 5 surface area focused on land control, natural, and focused primarily on spacing by working with private landowners in the development of and provide access to protect land adjacent
Thank you. Good luck. And so this is where I've sort of left the talk flexible. And so the examples I've put together is I have an example of a geographic shift. And so what I've done for the LCT region is I've pulled together just a bunch of vegetation models at different scales. And so biome models, down through Landcover model to some species models. And what I do a lot in my work is I don't like one model, I look at all models, and I put them all together, and the places where they converge, I get really happy about, and the places they don't converge, I also get really happy about, because sometimes that gives me insight into what might be happening in those places. And so that's one example we could talk about if you wanted to. I've also brought an example of like an spatial index where This was the Arctic LCC in Molly and Erica both worked on this. They used NatureServe to rank Arctic birds in terms of climate change vulnerability. And so in that example, we can look at how different birds fall out relative to one another, and then also look at where experts thought, their sensitivities lie. And that gives you some ideas about what sort of management actions might be useful for those species in a climate change context. Let me see what was. And then I also have I have an example of an index that's spatial and global. And so groups ranked a bunch of different species based on sensitivity, exposure, and adaptive capacity, and then they rank hotspots globally. So what places had the most sensitive exposed species. But it's a global analysis. And then I also have just a conceptual model from this region from some of Terry's work, trying to think about the feedback between different parts. And that's a very complicated story, for example, like we were talking about fire yesterday and whether fire was moving towards resilience or moving towards transformation. And correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is sometimes it does both. So if you burn in conditions in Black Spruce where it was a little cooler fire and you avoid the cooler fire, you might keep your moss layer, and that would protect your cold soil and your permafrost, and that would be a feedback that would bring you back to Black Spruce. Whereas if you had fires that were hot, that might put that on, that might expose that permafrost, be black, so a lot of sun would be going in there, and that might be that sort of feedback that brings you to a new place. Or we can just talk generally about whether, what types of vulnerability assessments people might want to do. Okay. Yeah, this is, I actually think this is a really interesting story. I had to sleep on it, and then I was really surprised by laying these things together. And so I'm going to start, this is some work that Jack Williams at University of Wisconsin did. And so he's a paleo guy, and he's a climate guy. And so he looks like backwards and forwards in climate. And what he did is he looked just at climate, and he clustered climate. So he could say, these are climate things that are similar empirically, right? And so he would cluster these things, and then he projects them forward. And the whole purpose is to say, can I identify areas that are novel, that we don't have an analog for today? So these are non-analog climate spaces. And so in the top two slides, this is two emission scenarios, the A2 and B1. And in the A2, both of them, if you look up, in our region up here, we're blue, which in this case means, globally, these are not non-analog climates. These climates exist on Earth, right? Now down here, he twisted that a little bit. So he put the twist of, okay, now I'm going to ask, but is it a regional climate? And when you think about that, you're thinking, are the species that are adapted to this climate, are they close or are they really far away? And in this case, again, we have this little yellow piece, but mostly pretty blue. And that's within 500 kilometers, right? That's a home. And then the next thing I looked at, this is from Terry's ecosystem book, Principles of Ecosystem. But it's also in this climate change. I actually took it from a different source, so I took it from this impacts of climate change on biodiversity ecosystems. But just to get at this idea that biomes are really structured by climate, right? And so temperature and precipitation, you can graph those out where different biomes sit. And the thing that I was looking at here, and especially about my work on the Kenai, is the Boreal forest tundra grassland interface is so tight. And And that's a lot of the transitions we're thinking about in the Kenai. Is it going to convert from black spruce or white spruce to grassland? Is it going to go from alpine to grassland? So the take-home message is here that biomes are structured by climate, and that, you know, in Alaska we sit at this, and especially in this altitude, we sit at this interesting space between boreal tundra and grassland. And these are some models of geographic shifts of biomes. And so this is some work that they did using not just climate envelopes, but also a vegetation dynamics model. And if you look at this, so this is boreal forest, the green. The gray on top is tundra. And the yellow is grassland. And these are very coarse, right? So going into the future, again up here, you see sort of the same kind of this sort of anomaly over here, turning to grassland. And yet most of this part of the LCC stays boreal forest. Okay. And then there's another person who did biome models. And but they just sort of have a little more broken down biomes. So they say, well, this is Canadian boreal forest, and this is Alaska boreal forest. We're different, you know? You guys are trying to get along, but, you know. And then they projected it forward. And what's really interesting here, again, I'm just sort of showing you the messages I took from this. Okay, you got this really weird anomaly down here. Like, what's going on there? It's just like, you know, you got all, look. And we say it's not even consistent, it's all different things. But up here, the boreal forest is just Canadian boreal forest. Maybe Canadians are going to move the border, I don't know. But, so again, the same story is starting to echo a little bit, right? Which I was part of, like, the boreal forest is gone. It's moving, it's gone, you know. And, now this is SNAP. And so SNAP's approach is they took the climate data, and again, they clustered the climate data. So they didn't, so you have two sort of approaches. You can do like a mechanistic vegetation model. It's like really awesome. It takes a lot of data. You can link your climate to a biome, so the biome is telling you what the climate space looks like, or you can just cluster the climate data, right? And that's what SNAP did. And then they did some gut checks, like, okay, we clustered it, now let's compare it to what's really there. Does it make sense? And it seemed to. Now, in this case, they had 18 categories, or 17, 17. And I grouped them together. So that, okay, these are all boreal forests, and this is tundra, and this is Pacific Maritime, which, you know, not as seen as one right here, but maybe not things are more up here. And so let's look at that. Like, if we're really just looking, you know, if we're scaling that to a true biome, boreal forest biome, what does that look like? And look at that. So, yeah, this is Saskatchewan grassland. Again, coming in. Good places here, but it's sort of anomaly over here. And like the rest of it, pretty similar. Although, you know, this isn't to say that things are going to be exactly the same. So this is one that, you know, they're looking at the 17 types. They got a lot of different types of boreal forest going on here. And you know, like, there's different types of boreal forest. And climate influences those things. And these are the maps, so people want to look at these. These are these maps over there. So if you want to look at those at lunch or whatever. But when you look at it like this, things are moving. And it's not like, you know, so it's not like, you know, black spruce forests are going to remain forever necessarily. There may be some serious restructuring in terms of species composition in this part. So it's still the boreal biome, but it might look really different, right? And so sometimes when I look at these models, this is looking at, so that model is 2030, 2060, 2090, yeah. And you can look at, does this change biome every 30 years? Like, is the climate changing that fast, or is it just like it flips and then it stabilizes a little bit? Although there's a little caveat to that because, you know, these models, like, if you're seeing summer that's way outside, you might just hit that extreme and maybe there's nothing outside of that space. So, with that caveat. But anyway, so these areas here, the red, every 30 years, it looks more similar to a different biome. So when you think about that, like, you know, like as a manager, I think, what does that mean? You know, like, but there's some, you know, there's spatial variability there. Let's find out. Something to think about. And so now this is these facts over there, and this is work I did for Landcover. Now this is just the climate envelope of Landcover. And the way to think about this is just the climate space, and other things mediate this. Okay, so and so I kind of think of these things as just the climate space. And if you think in terms of resilient basins, like, you know, when those flow variables like climate change, like, I'm not saying you have to transition because of some types, but you're probably a little more stressed. So you can think of this like, this is vulnerability, like your climate basins change, you know, your things that have adapted to a different climate. They might make it, you know, it doesn't say, or they might not be able to move, but you can kind of think of them as being more stressed, right? And so I looked across 8 different GCMs and emission scenarios, different groupings of those from SNAP. And I modeled Landcover today, and then Landcover in 100 years, basically. And across all the different GCMs and emission scenarios, so the red areas transition in all 8 of them. And the blue ones, they stay pretty much the same in terms of land cover. And so this is, again, this is, we think of this like, you know, if every model is saying you're going to transition, you might think about that space a little differently than the space where only one says it's going to transition land cover. And again, these are prescriptive, so these are just things to think about to get the creative thoughts going, not like a space will be the same as with the 2 because it's model first there, you know. So anyway, this is stepping down from the the biome stuff, right? And so this is from the National Landcover data set. It's coarse, but this is what we have for Alaska, so you guys do some super awesome vegetation, remote sensing stuff, which I think you're already doing, right? There you go. Because of this, yeah, as you know, I don't even know what's going on in Canada, so we won't even think about that. But of course, it's like evergreen forest, deciduous forest, alpine tundra, these sorts of things, right? And again, but just to sort of give you sort of what I think the story is. So this is 2090, and what I did is I gave each model a boat, and to do this one, I just took the Landcover plastic out of the most boat, right? So I can combine all those models. And what you see is, again, it's sort of that same, like, it's mixed forest, but that's not totally radical from this area. It's not like it's saying, but down here in the Kenai, it's interesting, down on the Horse Edge, we're getting grassland. And what's really remarkable about this, is just many of you know, Homer had a huge mosquito outbreak. And the let throughs really high mortality. And going back in some of those areas, there's zero recruitment of life force, right? And so the question was, is it just seed trees? Like, there's no seed trees. And the cattle growth, the blue joint grass grew in those areas, so now it's very grass. And so even if a seed fell, it's hard for them to get down to the soil. But then the weird thing is, you know, it's a question like if we planted white spruce and not spruce, would they make it? I don't know, but the weird thing is a few years ago we had a spring grass-fed fire, and we've never had one, right? And I did my master's in Texas, and I look at that and I say, that's just Savannah feedback. Because what happens in savanna systems is you got trees dispersed around and they've got their seeds and little seedlings are down in the grass where they can grow, and a fire rips through and kills them. And then the grass can grow back because it has some roots, right? And so we're starting to think about, is this a transition, right? And if it is, can we push it back to forested? And if it is, if we can, we want to, and if we do, should we be planting white spruce or should we be planting lodgepole or shore pine? And so this has sort of set us up to think about common garden experiments, because we don't know the answer, but we're thinking about planting across Kenai to start setting up a science background to ask these questions, right? And I'm starting to talk to people because, you know, just if that's something to savannah, I mean, people are going to have really different expectations about what fires are going to look like. And, you know, that fire in grassland, it was started by, because what happened is the spruce came in, and then everybody was worried about fire danger. And so they built roads to establish logs, and then they subdivided off those roads. And so there's a lot of cabins in there now. So this is a complex story, right? No drivers. But somebody was out there sharpening tools in cabin, and it sparked, set it on. And he burned down all the papers. Like, this man probably can't live there anymore, right? But, you know, who would have thought? Like, we never saw spring fires. And in fact, Alaska Fire Service expanded their fire window into the spring because of that fire. Because we, you know, in Alaska, we didn't have resources to deal with it. No one was, you know, fire people were on vacation, so they were expecting to, like, be ready for that. Okay. And so then about this, and then you can even step these things down. So these are thinking about species. And I'm just going to go over the script, but you can look at species and say, are they matching these signals or not, right? And again, the more these things converge, the more you say, wow, maybe we have some certainty. The less they do, maybe areas that are not, maybe we have a more open ecological window. Maybe we could do a lot more different stuff, you know? Or not, I don't know. But this is just accent, right? And so if you think about it, the blue's not as good for them, the green is better for them. And you're seeing some, you know, changes in where aspen are going to do well. And this is some of Glenn Juday's work looking at white spruce, and he's seeing a lot of white spruce stress. Because that's what happens to trees, right? The climate shifts, and they're still there, and they're still alive, but they're stressed, right? And in this case, he's linking this to evapotranspiration. So even in some riparian places, if it's warm enough, they're losing a lot of water, and then when insects come in, or it gets so hot they just can't make it. But again, there's a lot of geographic variability here because, like, you have this threshold where, you know, for a while it's really good to be warmer. You can go faster until you hit that threshold where you're losing too much water, and then things just suck. Right? And so you see, like, northern slopes, white spruce might do good there still. You know, but some other southern exposure slopes, maybe we shouldn't be thinking of replanting white spruce in those places, right? Or maybe after fire, we should be looking for different species coming in. And so a lot of my work on the Kenai too, but to think about these things, like, so we've had this transition in the southern part. Well, our northern part is still looking more like Saskatchewan grasslands than what it was in the past, right? And yet, we're in year 90 of an 80-year fire cycle. And so we're sort of setting up our capacity to say, hey, when we have that fire, let's go in and see what comes back, right? Or this might be our opportunity if things look really bad to plan. So again, these sorts of models